You grow up being told a story, over and over again, that certain people are dangerous, that their very existence is a threat, that their skin color is a symbol of inferiority. You hear it in school. You read it in books. You see it plastered on every wall, every newspaper.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
Forces rolled through a shattered, war-torn Germany, and the face of the enemy didn't look like what they were promised. Instead of the monsters they had been conditioned to expect, these women encountered black American soldiers, men like those in the 761st Tank Battalion, nicknamed the Black Panthers, and the 92nd Infantry Division. And just like that, the entire narrative collapsed. For years, the Nazi regime had filled German society with relentless propaganda about racial hierarchy. Black people were portrayed as brutal, primitive, subhuman. They were the shadowy other in the racial fantasy the Reich was trying to build. Most German civilians had never even seen a black person. Their entire understanding came from lies, caricatures, and fear. So when these women looked up and saw the first black soldiers step into their towns, their villages, their homes, it was a moment of sheer panic. You can imagine it, right? The way your stomach would twist. The fear, the tension, and then something very different happened. Instead of violence, they saw discipline, respect, order, kindness. These men helped carry the wounded. They handed out rations to starving families. They protected civilians from looters. They behaved, simply put, with humanity. And that was the most radical thing of all. Because once you witness kindness from the person you've been taught to hate, the lie can't hold anymore. That moment, a shared glance, a helping hand, a soft word becomes a crack in the wall of ideology. The dissonance was overwhelming. These were supposed to be the villains. They had been warned about savagery. And here was a black man gently tying a tourniquet on a German boy's leg. Here was a soldier who had been forced to sit in the back of the bus back home, helping an old woman find shelter in a city his army had just liberated. The shock wasn't just emotional. It was intellectual, spiritual, existential. Imagine living your entire life believing the sky is green. And then one day, someone pulls back the curtain and it's blue. You feel confused, angry, betrayed, but most of all, you feel awake. And for many German women, these encounters were a form of awakening. The reality of these soldiers, their dignity, their decency forced them to reckon with the monstrous falsehoods they had internalized. And in some cases, it changed their lives forever. There were women who went further than just acknowledgement. They fell in love. Yes, despite the tension, the trauma, the cultural chasm, some of these German women formed relationships with black soldiers. Real relationships. Not wartime flings. Not curiosities. Love. Can you imagine how much courage that took? To fall in love with the very person your entire culture told you to fear. To walk down a street with a black partner in post-Nazi Germany and endure the stares, the whispers, the threats, not just from neighbors, but sometimes from the very military that soldiers served in. These couples weren't just breaking social codes. They were detonating them. In an age before civil rights, in a country freshly emerging from genocide, interracial love was a quiet, radical act of defiance. And it didn't come without cost. Many of these women were ostracized. Some were shunned by their families. Others lost friends. But still, they chose to stand by their partners. Some even moved to the United States only to arrive in a segregated country where the men they loved could fight in a war but not sit at a lunch counter. The irony is hard to ignore. Black soldiers were liberators abroad and second-class citizens at home. They could defend Europe from fascism, but couldn't rent a hotel room in Georgia. They could help rebuild a shattered Germany, but couldn't vote freely in Mississippi. So these women weren't just stepping into love, they were stepping into another layer of injustice. But their presence, their stories, their existence began to chip away at the structures around them. They humanized a struggle that had been invisible to most of white Europe. They started telling the truth. Take someone like Margaret Schiller. She wasn't just a young girl confused by the war's end. She became a storyteller, an activist, a voice. She later said that meeting black soldiers changed everything she thought she knew about the world. That single experience was enough to detonate a lifetime of indoctrination. It's not just about affection, it's about revelation. Because once you see the lie, you can't unsee it. Margaret became a teacher. And she didn't just teach dates and treaties. She taught compassion. She told her students that the enemy is often the story you're told before you've met the person. And let's talk about the soldiers themselves, because their dignity, their restraint, their compassion was not accidental. It was intentional. It was forged in pain and pride. These men knew they were being watched by the Germans, by the Americans, by history. They carried the weight of their race on their backs in every interaction. One misstep, one outburst, and the stereotype would be confirmed in the eyes of their commanders. So they carried themselves with steel, not because they had to, but because they chose to rise above. That's power. Their service wasn't just a battlefield duty. It was a moral stand. And they were heroes twice over, first for liberating cities, then for liberating minds. And it's easy to say now, well, of course people should have known better. But when you live under authoritarian rule, information is power and propaganda is poison. These women didn't just wake up racist one morning. They were fed it with their school books, their newspapers, their national mythologies, which is why this story matters so much. Because when those same women came face to face with truth and chose to listen, they proved that change is possible, that indoctrination can be reversed, that racism.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
The intimate, personal revolutions that begin with nothing more than kindness. A shared meal, a bandaged wound, a stolen moment of laughter between people who were never supposed to speak, let alone fall in love. And for every one of those stories, a little more of the lie died. So when we look back now, what are we really looking at? Yes, this is a tale of war, of propaganda, of indoctrination. But more than that, it's a story of people who chose to see, who chose to stop, and think, and change. That's where the real power lies. Not in tanks, not in ideology, but in the quiet courage of individuals saying, no, this isn't what I believe anymore. And that's the message echoing forward. Because racism didn't end with the Reich. It didn't die in the rubble of Berlin. It's still here. And every time we buy into stereotypes, every time we judge before we know, every time we cling to comfortable lies, we're repeating history's worst habits. But the antidote is still the same. Meet people. Listen to their stories. Question what you've been taught. Be willing to see the sky is blue. The greatest revolutions don't always start with riots. Sometimes, they start with eye contact, a helping hand, a thank you in a foreign tongue. That's the story here. That's the legacy. Not just of soldiers or civilians, but of people brave enough to unlearn hate. And if you're still here, thanks for sticking with this one. Stories like this deserve to be told and remembered. Drop a comment. Had you heard of this before? What part hit hardest for you? And if you've ever had a moment that made you rethink something you were taught, share it. That's how we keep the empathy alive. And you already know, subscribe for more stories like this. We dig up the chaos, the overlooked, the moments that matter. Because sometimes, the biggest battles are fought in silence inside the human heart. The thing about history is that it doesn't just sit quietly in a textbook. It lingers. It echoes. It plants itself in the way we look at the world without even realizing it. And this story, the one about German women and Black American soldiers in 1945, is one of those rare moments in history that snaps people awake. Because when you strip away the uniforms, the ruins, the politics, what you're left with is something impossibly raw. The human experience colliding with propaganda at full speed. Let's go back to that moment. Germany, post-surrender, spring of 45. The cities are rubble. The air smells like ash and iron. People are starving, dazed, wandering through their own neighborhoods like ghosts. The Nazi regime has fallen, but the effects of its poison are still very much alive in the minds of its people. And then here come the Allies. Tanks rolling in, flags flying, American accents cutting through the silence. And among those American soldiers, for the first time in many German towns, are Black men. Now remember, these women, these civilians had been bombarded with a very specific, very ugly lie their entire lives. That Black men were dangerous, that they were uncivilized, that they were to be feared. It was textbook white supremacist propaganda, baked into their education, their entertainment, their government policies. These weren't just stereotypes, they were state-issued. And suddenly, standing right in front of them, in uniform, with medals and boots and the weight of the world behind their eyes, were real human beings who didn't fit any of the propaganda. Can you imagine the mental rewiring that had to happen? These women braced themselves for violence. And instead, they got help. They expected to be humiliated. And instead, they were treated with dignity. They were prepared for chaos and were met with calm. It wasn't just surprising. It was paradigm shifting. let's talk about how personal that shift was. Think about a German mother. Her home half-bombed, her child sick, her pantry empty. She hears boots outside. Soldiers. She looks out the window, heart pounding, and sees a black man in an American uniform. She freezes, fear gripping every muscle. And then, he knocks gently on her door and hands her food. The propaganda doesn't survive that moment. It can't, because now, she has a face, a name, a memory. Maybe she never thought about race again in the same way. Maybe she told her children a different story than the one she grew up with. Maybe that one moment changed the way an entire family viewed the world. It's hard to overstate how powerful that is, how rare it is for propaganda to collapse so completely and so quickly under the weight of lived experience. But let's not romanticize this too much. These weren't fairy tales. These relationships and encounters came with layers of complexity and pain. For the German women, there was the risk of social isolation. People whispered, families cut ties, communities turned cold. In a nation that had only just started crawling out of the wreckage of its racist obsession with purity, stepping outside the lines wasn't just frowned upon, it was dangerous. And for the black soldiers, it was even more complicated. They were liberators in one moment, and reminders of inequality the next. These men wore the uniform of a country that asked them to die for freedom abroad while denying them basic rights at home. The irony was unbearable. They could walk through the Brandenburg Gate but not the front door of a restaurant in Alabama. They could win medals in Europe but couldn't buy a house in an all-white neighborhood in the US. So when these soldiers built connections with the very people their country had just defeated, when they found friendship, and in many cases, love, it meant something. It was rebellion. It was grace. It was hope. Let's talk about the aftermath. Because war ends, but life doesn't. Some of these couples tried to stay together. Some women followed their partners to America, only to find a whole new version of segregation waiting for them. The racism wasn't gone, it had just changed dialect. Imagine being a German woman, having survived a fascist regime, only to move to the land of the free and realize your husband couldn't even walk beside you in some towns. And for those who stayed behind, they raised children, mixed-race children, in a country that didn't know what to do with them, that had no framework for inclusion, that looked at these kids and saw disruption, rather than beauty. Those kids grew up fighting their own battles. They were reminders of a moment Germany wasn't ready to confront, a moment that said, you were wrong, a moment that couldn't be erased from memory or bloodlines. But here's the beauty in that pain: they didn't go away. Those kids grew up. Some became artists, some became scholars, some became activists, and they carried with them the legacy of that initial collision between truth and propaganda. They were living proof that love could outlast ideology, that humanity could outlast hate. Let's also acknowledge the sheer grace it must have taken for these soldiers to extend compassion in the first place. These were men who were raised in the shadow of Jim Crow, who trained in segregated camps, who knew that when they returned home, their skin would be seen as a threat rather than a badge of honor. And yet they led with empathy. They helped the people who had been taught to despise them. Why? Because they understood something the world hadn't caught up to yet. That dignity isn't conditional. That compassion isn't transactional. That doing what's right doesn't depend on whether it's recognized. These men walked into the heart of enemy territory and showed kindness. That is a level of moral clarity most of us can only hope to achieve. Their service on and off the battlefield was revolutionary, not just in what it accomplished, but in what it revealed. The lie at the heart of racism is always weakest when it faces real people. And this isn't just some sepia-tone story from the past. It's a mirror. It asks, what lies are we still living under? What propaganda, subtle or loud, are we still swallowing without question? Who are we afraid of, simply because someone told us to be? Because here's the truth. Systems of hate rely on distance. They rely on separation. They rely on you never meeting the person you're supposed to hate. But once you meet them, once you see the humanity, the complexity, the kindness, the system starts to crumble. And if enough people see that, really see it, the whole system can fall. That's what this story is about. It's not just war, or race, or love. It's about clarity, about what happens when the fog lifts, and you realize you've been lied to your whole life and you choose to think for yourself. That's the real victory. Because propaganda doesn't end with surrender. But truth has a way of sneaking in anyway. Through a knock at the door, a shared meal, a smile between people who were told they should hate each other. If that's not revolutionary, I don't know what is. So, what do you think? Had you ever heard this part of history before? Did anything surprise you? Drop your thoughts in the comments because these are the conversations that matter. And if you're into stories that challenge the narrative, peel back the layers, and dive deep into moments the history books skip over, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, and come back for more. Because sometimes the most powerful battles are the quiet ones. The ones fought in living rooms, in glances, in choices. The ones that remind us, truth doesn't need permission to be seen. It just needs the chance. And let's sit with that for a second because this isn't just a warm and fuzzy footnote to the war. This is a full-on narrative rupture. You have to understand, these women weren't just reevaluating the soldiers in front of them, they were reevaluating themselves. Their upbringing, their beliefs, their identities. That's not easy. It's uncomfortable. It's embarrassing. It's destabilizing. But it's also how change starts. Because once you admit that one part of the story was a lie, you start pulling on the threads. If the Nazis lied about black people, what else did they lie about? If these soldiers are kind, dignified, even heroic, then what does that say about the people who painted them as monsters? It's like finding out your whole life was written in pencil and someone hands you a pen. You can rewrite it, but you have to choose to. And many of these women did. They didn't just move on. They passed their stories down. They told their children, their grandchildren, I met someone who changed how I see the world. That matters. Because history isn't just shaped by generals and treaties. It's shaped by moments, by relationships, by unexpected acts of grace. That's why this story still resonates. Because it reminds us that even in the rubble, even after one of the most horrific regimes in history, truth can get through. Love can survive. Humanity can prevail. It might start with a meal shared between enemies, a gesture of kindness across a divide, a laugh in a language neither party speaks fluently. That's how healing begins. Not with speeches, with connection. So if you've ever felt like the world is too broken to fix, like the hate is too deep, the division's too wide, remember this. A regime spent years pumping poison into the minds of its people. And in a matter of weeks, a few thousand black soldiers dismantled it, not with weapons but with dignity. Thanks so much for watching. If you made it all the way to the end, you're officially part of the small percentage of people who don't just click away, and that means a lot. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me your thoughts, your ideas, or even what you'd like to see next. I read every single one of them, and your feedback genuinely shapes the direction of this channel. If you enjoyed the video, tap that like button. It tells YouTube this content is worth sharing. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next upload. We've got more exciting videos coming, and trust me, you'll want to be here for them. This channel is just getting started, and your support helps it grow faster than you realize. Thank you again for spending a part of your day here with me. Stay curious, stay motivated, and as always, take care of yourself. Until next time, I'll see you in the next video.